Welcome, everyone. So good to see you with us today. Happy to be learning together. Welcome as well to those who are joining us on Facebook. Today's class, The Poetics of Mishnah, a Methodological Approach with Rabbi Dr. Avi Walfish and Rabbanit Dr. Adina Sternberg. As a reminder, this class is being taught, and Rabbi Walfish and Rabbanit Dr. Sternberg alternate weeks and topics. This class is part of Darisha's ongoing Mishnah project dedicated to the memory of a great lover and student of Mishnah, Rivka Rosenwein, Zichronah Livracha. Just a few words about how we run the class. If you're able to turn on your video, we would love to be able to see you, just so we feel like we're together in a class setting. If not, we understand. And with that, I'll turn this to you, Dr. Walfish.
Okay, thank you. Let's put up the text on the screen here. Okay, today the topic for today's shiur is parallelism and chiasmus. Okay, chiasmus, for those who might not have encountered the term previously, is kind of mirror image parallelism. If a parallelism would be A, B, A, B, or A, B, C, A, B. Those would be two different kinds of parallel structures. Chiasmus would be A, B, B, A, or A, B, C, B, A. Okay, so this is a very powerful literary tool. Actually, although I think most of us are probably more familiar with parallelism than with chiasmus, but chiasmus is actually has very ancient roots and appears and has been studied in literature from time immemorial, especially ancient and pre-modern literature. In contemporary literature, it's a bit less prevalent, although it exists there as well, and has tremendous amount of literature describing it. Okay, but parallelism, we often use parallelism in a very simple way. The Mishnah, for example, will just bring you two parallel lists, okay, then vary one detail. Say in case A, then we'll have qualities 1, 2, 3, and 4. And in case not A, then we will have the opposite of qualities 1, 2, 3, and 4. Okay, that's a simple kind of parallelism. You'll find a lot of that in the Mishnah. What's going to interest us is the literary use of parallelism, which is often much harder to detect. Okay, so let's dive into an example and we'll get a sense of what we're talking about. Okay, so I have an example here up on the screen. Okay, the beginning of the 8th chapter of Bava Kama. First 6 chapters of Bava Kama are devoted to damages to property. Okay, and usually it's damages by property. Okay, there are some examples in these chapters of damages by human beings, but it's damages to property, usually by property. Okay, and then in chapter 8, you may have noticed I skipped over a chapter. Chapter 8, we talk about one individual injuring another. Okay, called hachovel. So we've moved up to human beings injuring one another. Okay, now what that intermediate chapter is doing is a subject for another discussion, not for us to discuss right now. Okay, but you have chovel b'chavero, and as we'll see, it has some very unique features. Chovel b'chavero chayav alav mishum chamisha dvarim. There are 5 payments for chovel b'chavero. Now that already differentiates chovel from the kind of damages that were discussed during the first 6 chapters. because those were limited to one payment and one payment alone. The first on the list here, nezek, benezek. Nezek, tsar, ripui, shevet, boshet. Okay, those are the 5 payments. Nezek is the standard payment, and nezek just means the diminished value. Okay, you have to compensate the person for losing the value of whatever it is that he lost. So in one kind of damage, you destroy the object, so you price the object. What was that object worth? In another kind of damage, you don't destroy the object, but you damage it. So you have to figure out what the difference in its value is between what it was and what it is now. Okay, so if the market value for it before damaging was 100, and now that you've damaged it, it's worth 50, so that's what you have to compensate him. You have to pay him 50. That's called nezek. So that exists in damaging a human being as well. That immediately raises a question that, as we'll see, the Mishnah will hasten to address, and that is, how do you gauge the value of a person? Okay, so we'll see, for example, you cut off a person's hand, okay? You break his leg in such a way that it will never be the same. It will never be the same again. So this is permanent damage. So how do you assess, what the person was worth beforehand, what he's worth now? How is that measured? Okay, we'll see that very shortly. But that's called nezek. Sa'ar. Okay, you compensate the person, okay, for his physical pain. Okay, again, what is physical pain worth? Okay, now I'm sure you've all encountered that, in contemporary jurisprudence, we'll do something similar. Okay, in other words, when person was injured in an accident, then he can claim damages, and the damages could include, suffering and so on. Okay, so apparently contemporary jurisprudence has some way of estimating that, but what we'll want to see is how the Mishnah goes about calculating that. Ripui, okay, that's medical expenses for healing. Shevet, okay, shevet means unemployment. Okay, the person, because of the injury, was unable to go to work for X amount of time. So you have to compensate him for the lost time. And boshet, okay? Boshet is humiliation, okay? You have to compensate him for the humiliation. Now, again, these last 4 payments, tsar, ripui, shevet, boshet, don't exist when you're talking about property damages. Okay, but they do exist when one human injures another. Okay, and now the Mishnah details these payments. Benezek ketzad, simate no katat yado shiberet raglo. So here are 3 examples of the kind of damage we're talking about. What we're talking about is permanent damage. Okay, so the person has his hand cut off, the person is blinded. His eye is plucked out, or the eye is permanently damaged. Okay, shiber et raglo, and this would presumably mean a break that can't be repaired. Okay, so ro'ino to ki'ilu, a key term in the Mishnah, we see him as though hu eved nimkar bashuk v'shamin kama yafet v'chama hu yafet. In order to calculate his market value before and after, you have to view him as though he were a slave. Okay, a slave who is sold in the marketplace. Okay, and as a slave sold in the marketplace, so the going rate for a slave of his age, body build, skills, what have you. When he has his hand or his leg is one thing, and after his hand or leg have been removed or permanently injured, he's worth that much less. That's how you calculate the nezek. Okay, so even though he's not a slave, but in order to calculate his monetary value, you have to view him as though he were a slave. Tsar. Okay, so tsar kiva'o b'shapuro b'masmir. Tsar could be even in a case where there is no nezek. Okay, so for example, it could be that he suffered a burn. Vafilot porno. Okay, now a burn will disfigure him somewhat, but what if he suffered the burn on his nail, on his fingernail or toenail? So he's not disfigured. Nevertheless, he suffered pain. Makom sheno oseh chabura. Omdin kam adam kayotze bazeh, rotze litol liot mitzler kach. So we have to calculate how much would a person of this nature, we have to estimate this person's nature, okay, and see how much would he want to take, okay, in order to do that. In other words, if I come in and say, I am doing a scientific experiment, okay, about the effects on a person of suffering this kind of pain. Okay, I'm going to burn your fingernail. Okay, and so now how much money would I have to pay you for you to be willing to be my guinea pig for this experiment? Okay, the Gemara, by the way, says for most people the answer is I wouldn't do it for any amount of money. Okay, and therefore the Gemara sort of flips it around and says, let's say that you were going to have to go an operation. So you could undergo the operation with or without an anesthetic. How much money would you pay to do it with the anesthetic rather than without? Okay, so that's the amount of money that pain is worth to you. The amount of money you would pay to save yourself that. Okay, so not somebody paying you because you'd say, Michael Toivus, I don't need any money and I don't want the pain. But here, okay, you're here the question is, okay, how much money would I take out of pocket in order to save myself that pain? That's already something that could be calculated. Beyond a certain amount of money, you're going to say, you know what, I'll suffer the pain and forget it. I'm not going to pay exorbitant amounts of money just to avoid pain. Ripui ikahu chayav l'rapoto. Okay, so and now we're talking about healing. And healing, notice, the Mishnah doesn't say how much money to pay. The Mishnah formulates it as he has to heal him. Now, presumably, if he himself is not a doctor, then he has to pay money to some other doctor to heal him. The Gemara argues that even if he is a doctor, the injured party can say to him, "Hey, listen, I don't want you to be the one who heals me. I've had enough experience with you. Okay, you pay money to another doctor. I want to go to him. I don't want to go to you. I've had very negative associations with you. I don't want you to be my doctor." Okay, so he has to heal him, meaning he has to put out the money in order to heal. And the Mishnah then continues and says, now what happens if after he's healed, an infection sets in? Because it was ostensibly healed, but then an infection sets in. So if doctors estimate that the infection is a direct result of the injury, was not fully healed, then he has to heal him a second time. When he paid money, the doctor said he's healed. And then the infection set in, and the doctor says, not because of me, it's because it wasn't properly healed the first time around. So he's got to go through another round of treatment, and the tortfeasor, the one who injured, has to pay for that as well. But sometimes it just coincidentally it happens to develop an infection, not because of the original wound, and then the person who injured him is not liable for that. Okay. Okay, I'm going to jump down a bit. Shevet, ro'ino tokilu shomer kishuin. Shekvar natan lo dmei yado dmei raglo. We'll start with the second line here. The Mishnah is addressing an issue that we probably didn't think about when we first talked about these 5 damages, but the Mishnah is very concerned about this. It says, how can you pay him for his unemployment when you already paid him for his hand and his leg? Which tells us something very significant, and that is, when we are calculating his decreased value because of the injury, what we're really calculating is his decreased earning power. Because when you purchase a slave on the market, what are you really purchasing? You're purchasing a worker who you can put to work, for whatever you want, right? You're purchasing him as a worker. Now, the point is, you're purchasing him as a worker for life. So the amount of money you spend is what you calculate he will be worth to you over the years, given that you don't know what his life expectancy is. You don't know how many years he'll be healthy, and how productive he'll be over the years. You've got to factor all of that in, but the market has a way of doing that, okay? An assessor can come in, look at this fellow, look at his actuarial tables, and say, I figure I'm going to get 30 good years of work out of this guy. Afterwards, I don't know. Okay, so 30 years of somebody with his strength and ability is worth X amount of money to me. So effectively, when you pay him the nezek, you have effectively compensated him for all the work he's not going to be doing the rest of his life, right? You injured him. Now he can't go back to work again. And so what's that worth? That's the nezek. So why am I also paying him for the weeks that he's laid up in bed? Anyway, I already paid him for all of his future unemployment. So the answer is, I paid him for his future unemployment as a laborer in the fields. Okay, he was able to do the plowing and the hoeing and the harvesting and all the work I need in the fields. He was able to do work as a construction worker, or he had some kind of skill that he was able, he could work as a tailor, a carpenter, whatever it was, right? All of these things whatever it was he could have done, for that I compensated him. Now that I cut off his hand or his leg, he can't do that work, but what can he do? He can still be a guard, sit at the opening to a shopping mall and check people's bags as they enter, right? He can do that. Okay, so, but he can't do it while he's laid up in bed. That's called shevet. Okay, so we see him as though he were a guard of a zucchini field. Okay, because I already paid him for his inability to work in his previous job. For that, I compensated him for life. That's the nezek. Okay, so now I have to additionally compensate him for his weeks of being laid up and being completely unemployable, even at a much less well-paying job. As far as boshet is concerned, I have to calculate how much the boshet is based on the social standing of the two people. Okay, the higher the social standing of each of them, the more boshet will be involved. Okay, the more embarrassing it will be, and therefore the more money I will have to compensate. And the Mishnah gives a list of several cases that don't have boshet, because these are people who are in situations where the injury didn't really, person is standing outside naked, stark naked, okay, and I injure him. He's not more embarrassed by the injury than he is or ought to be by the fact that he's standing naked in full view of the public, okay? Or if he's a blind person, blind people, again, are low enough on the social totem pole. Excuse me, I might have thought that, but the Mishnah says otherwise. Even though he is already embarrassed, but this adds additional embarrassment, okay? And even if I embarrass somebody who's sleeping, he might not have experienced the embarrassment, but when he wakes up and realizes what happened, then he will feel the embarrassment, okay? And so he gets compensated for that, okay? That's the list of 5 things, okay? Now, the first thing that we'll note is that the Mishnah already drew a connection between 2 of the damages. But the truth is, it's actually a more fully developed structure. These 5 damages are not just 5 separate types of payment. You could regard each one of them as a separate kind of payment. And in fact, each one of them has a separate biblical source. Each one has a biblical pasuk, and the psukim are spread out all over the Torah. Okay? Shmot, Vayikra, Dvarim, they're not all together in one place. Okay? So we could view them as all separate, but if we look at it more closely, then we'll see that in fact they fall into a pattern. Let's start off with ripui. We already noted in reading that ripui stands out from the crowd. And ripui is the 3rd of the 5 kinds of damages. It stands out because it's not defined as a payment. And what's more, we go back and look at the Mishnah, the fact that it's not a payment, okay, it reflects itself in the fact that all of the other damages, I make an estimate. The Mishnah tells me how to estimate it. It tells me, what criteria to use for estimating how much each one is worth. I estimate it. I pay it. Finished. Okay. I then get a receipt, and that's it. I don't have to pay. What happens with the person who, okay, what happens with the ripui? Well, what happens if after he's here, I paid him the money, okay? I said, okay, the doctor's going to cost you $1,000. Here's your $1,000. Go to the doctor, have him heal you, okay? And then turns out he's not healed. Okay, turns out that it came back. Okay, so I have to, so then I have to pay again. Okay, so I basically, I don't have to pay him a certain amount of money. I have to see to it that he gets healed, however much it costs. So I don't estimate it in advance. I just see, go to the doctor, send me the bill. And when you're completely healed, when the doctor has certified you're completely healed, then send me the bill, and that's what I'm going to pay. Okay, now obviously he can't go to the fanciest doctor in the world. I'm entitled to have some say in which doctor he goes to, that it be a reasonable amount. Okay, and the court will enforce that. But there's no set amount. Okay, I just have to pay his medical bills. So ripui is defined differently from everything else. And as you see, it's in the middle of this structure. Nezek and shevet. Now look, ro'ino to ki'ilu. We view him as though. Both nezek and shevet, we have to calculate based on something theoretical, not based on something real. What if he weren't what he is? What if he were somebody else? Okay, in the case of nezek, what if he were an eved? That's the only way I can calculate the nezek. When I'm calculating the shevet, what if he weren't a concert pianist, okay, but was a guard in front of a shopping mall? Okay, so ro'ino to ki'ilu, okay, that phrase is repeated. And why is the shevet calculated not based on what the profession he actually has, but the profession that he theoretically might have, because shekvar natan lo dmei yado dmei raglo, yado and raglo. That's again from the opening line of the Mishnah. I cut off his arm, I broke his leg, I pay him for the arm or for the leg. That's called nezek. So the Mishnah is both literarily and explicitly linking nezek and shevet. Nezek and shevet are a team. They go together. They correspond to one another. Nezek is corresponding him for his lifelong inability to return to his original profession. Shevet is compensating him for his temporary inability to start off on his new profession. So the two of them complement one another. They're connected to one another and they complement one another. Now, what's interesting is that Tsar and Boshet also correspond to one another. Tsar and Boshet, how do I calculate them? Tsar I calculate based on what kind of person is he? A person similar to him. Now, what that means is I have to figure out what this person's threshold of pain might be. Okay? I'll have to, ask people who know him well and say, how sensitive is he to pain? Some people will go to almost any length to avoid pain. Other people, okay, I'll live with a little pain, not so terrible. I'm not going to put myself out tremendously in order to avoid pain. I can live with the pain. That's Adam Kayotze Bazeh. What's Boshet? All according to the Mivayesh and Mitbayesh. Again, what kind of person is this? Now here, what kind of person is not his pain threshold, okay? The kind of person, when I'm talking about the kind of person here, I'm talking about his social standing, okay? Where he is in the social pecking order. But in both cases, I have to evaluate what kind of person is this, and based on that, I determine what to pay. Now, that's not the only connection between Tsar and Boshet. Tsar and Boshet have another point. Why is it that we see this connection between Tsar and Boshet? Because Tsar and Boshet are both compensations for the person's mental state. Nezek and Shevet are both compensating the person for the physical injury, Yado and Raglo. Tsar and Boshet are both compensating the person for his mental anguish. His mental anguish because of physical pain, in the case of Tsar, his mental anguish because of the social humiliation, in the case of Boshet. Okay, so now we see this parallel structure, A, B, C, A, B. Because you have A, B, then A, B, and in the middle you've got something that stands out. So it's A, B, C, A, B. That's our parallel structure. Now, question is, why does the Mishnah structure this in a parallel way? I could imagine, for example, that the Mishnah, since Nezek and Shevet go together, and since Tsar and Boshet go together, and Ripui stands alone, why didn't the Mishnah order it? Nezek, Shevet, Tsar, Boshet, and then Ripui at the end, right? So the things that go together are together. Okay, why didn't the Mishnah do things that way? Okay, so here, okay, that question is going to lead us into something that I think will reveal to us the power of a parallel structure. Okay, what is it that the Mishnah gains by presenting this as a parallelism rather than grouping them together? The things that belong together go together. Nezek and Shevet go together. That's paying him for his employment losses. Tsar and Boshet are compensating him for his mental anguish. Why don't I put those together in that way? Okay, so I think the answer is because in a certain sense, nezek and sa'ar belong together, and in a certain way, shevet and boshet belong together. How is that? Nezek and sa'ar belong together because they both relate to what happens to the person's body. When I injure a person physically, okay, so then when I just look at this person as an isolated unit, okay, so I am injuring him in two ways. One of them is physically. I am physically injuring the body. The second is I am mentally injuring the body. What do I mean by mentally injuring the body? There's physical pain. Pain is also a physical phenomenon, but it's a physical phenomenon that you experience mentally. Okay, it's not a physical phenomenon that you can see. It's a physical phenomenon that he experiences internally. So you have the external and internal aspects of the physical injury. Okay, that's nezek and tsar. That's how nezek and tsar go together. And what about shevet and boshet? Shevet we presented earlier as depriving the person, okay, of his earning power. That's true of shevet. Nezek is not only depriving the person of his earning power, it's also depriving the person of a piece of his body. Okay, now here we come to a point that I think is very, very central in the Mishnah's conception. And there's a point that's been noted by several 20th century scholars, okay, a couple of leading 20th century rabbis in particular noted this. One of them was Reb Chaim Soloveitchik. Another one was Rav Yitzchak Zev Gustman, okay, who came from Lithuania to Israel, led an important yeshiva in Yerushalayim. Okay, both of them note that nezek is not really, you're not really fully compensating the person when you pay him damages. You cannot really compensate a person for the loss of a hand, a leg, or an eye. But since the Torah requires you to do so, and in fact, how did the Torah formulate what has to be done to the person who poked out the other fellow's eye? Okay, what's supposed to happen to him? How did the Torah formulate it? Very well-known phrase in the Torah. Ayin tachat ayin. Eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, right? Injury for injury. What the Torah sounds like is, you took out the other person's eye, we'll take out your eye. That's what it sounds like. Chazal utterly rejected that reading. The debate going on to this very day as to whether the Torah really intended what we understand, what we understand to be the plain sense meaning, that you took out somebody else's eye, we'll take out your eye. There are many contemporary scholars who argue that that was never the Torah's intention. That Chazal, in fact, understood what the Torah intended exactly right. What the Torah meant is to compensate, not to avenge, but to compensate. However, what was argued both by Rav Chaim Soloveitchik and by Rav Gustman is the reason the Torah formulates it not as pay him the damages for the eye. It says, give him an eye for an eye, is because the Torah wants to indicate to you, you can never really compensate him. It's not like I injure his ox, I'll give him money to buy another ox. I injured his field, I'll pay him the value of what his field was worth. It's not the same thing. He'll never have the eye again. He'll never have the hand again. Never have the leg again. His whole life will be different. Okay. However, the only way to translate that into legal terms, according to Chazal, is to pay monetary compensation. And that's called, and that's why the Mishnah formulates it as Dmei Yado, Dmei Raglo. Okay? I'm not restoring his eye or his hand or his leg. I can't do that. And the Torah wants to indicate, don't think that just because you restored that value to him, that everything's fine. Okay? I injured his ox. I gave him back an ox. Okay. Let bygones be bygones. Everything's fine again. No, not everything is fine again. Not when I injured his eye, his hand, or his leg. Not everything is fine again. Yes, the only way I can compensate him is by translating the value of an eye, a hand, or a leg into monetary terms, which means view him as though he were a slave. If he were a slave, then indeed that's what his eye, hand, or leg would be worth in monetary terms. But no, I did not really compensate him. So Nezek and Tsar are really talking about, Nezek is not really about paying him unemployment. Paying him permanent unemployment is just a way of compensating him for something which I can't compensate for. I can never really compensate him for the loss of an eye, a hand, or a leg. So I do the next best thing. I compensate him for the economic value of the eye, hand, or leg. That's what's called nezek. And then I compensate him for tsa'ar. I can never fully compensate anybody for tsa'ar either. He suffered the pain. The money doesn't undo the pain. Okay, even if the pain was only momentary, that moment will never come back. He had a moment of severe pain because of me. I can never undo that. All I can do is compensate him for it. So in both nezek and tsar, I'm dealing with something physical that happened for which I can never fully compensate him. And what I can do is translate it into monetary terms and give him that kind of compensation. What about Shevet and Boshet? Can I fully compensate somebody for missing 3 weeks of work? Yes. The job he could have had now and didn't because he was laid up in bed for 3 weeks, I can compensate him for that. And that's full compensation. Why? Because when it comes to Shevet, I'm not really compensating him for something physical. I'm compensating him for something economic, and I would go a step further. I'm compensating him for something social. Shevet really means I removed him from the workforce. Every human being, okay, besides the fact that he earns his livelihood by going to work, he also attains his place in the society by going to work. Okay, by going to work, you become a contributing member of society. Shevet means for 3 weeks, he failed to do that. I deprived him of that opportunity. I have to compensate him for that. I have to restore his social standing by compensating him for his lost time of work. And that's essentially the same as Boshet. By the way, note, Shevet and Boshet go together also linguistically. Look at the similar, same letters, Shevet and Boshet. So that's another way that the Mishnah indicates Shevet and Boshet go together because both of them are about restoring the person's social standing. Boshet, okay, the person was humiliated, meaning he was knocked down a peg or two in terms of his social standing. What do I do? By compensating him, I am restoring his position in the social hierarchy. So what I would like to argue is that in fact, okay, the parallel structure gives us the following picture of what a person has to do when he damages. When I physically damage another human being, the Torah says, the Mishnah says, don't view this as just physical damage. First of all, you should understand how serious physical damage is. That's nezek. And see how hard it is to translate that into economic terms so that he can be compensated for it. That's the external physical damage. But then there's the internal physical damage called tsa'ar. That's all on the physical personal. That relates to the person's body. I have to compensate the person for what happened to his body, both what happened to it externally and what happened to it internally. I also have to compensate the person for his loss of social standing. That's in terms of his being knocked out of the workforce temporarily, and in terms of his humiliation. Okay, so I have to compensate him for that, for the external aspect of his lack of social standing and for the internal aspect of his lack of social standing. And what stands in the middle? Ripui. What does ripui mean? Ripui means healing the body. So after the two kinds of physical damage, the external and internal aspects of the physical damage, then the Mishnah turns to, okay, heal him, heal the body. After healing the body, you think, okay, I'm finished. No, you haven't finished. Why? Because a human being is a social being. He's not just an individual being. Okay, the first three took care of the individual. What about his social standing? You have to restore that too. And that also has two aspects. The external aspect corresponding to nezek. And here again, we see him as though he had a different profession, which he never had, but that's what he'll be good for now once he gets back into the workforce. And the mental aspect of his social standing, the boshet, which corresponds to the tsar, and which we have to evaluate based on what kind of individual is he, okay? How much physical pain can he endure and will he suffer? Okay, how serious will be his humiliation based on the social standing? So the parallel structure, I think, gives us a sense, these are not 5 separate payments. This is a system of payments that basically says, when you are compensating this person, you have to look at the whole picture. And the whole picture consists of these two axes, the physical personal axis and the social axis, the external axis and the mental axis. And that in turn gives rise to 4 different kinds of payment, and linking them together in the center is, and you have to heal him. You have to heal him to finish up your contending with the physical personal aspect, and to then move you on to the next aspect, which is the social. Okay, so that's the parallelism in this Mishnah that I think is very instructive in understanding this list of damages. And now let's move on to an instance of a chiasmus. Okay, and my instance here is the first chapter of Bava Kama. Okay. Do I have the text here? Yeah. Oh. Okay. I see. I didn't include here the text of the Mishnah in Bava Kama. Let's see if I can get that up on the screen for a moment.
Can I just ask something quickly?
Yeah, sure.
If I'm hearing you correctly, and thank you, you seem to be differentiating between this parallel structure in chapter 8 and more of a chiasm structure in chapter 1. Is that what you're suggesting? You know, as it could have, chapter 8 could have worked A, B, C, B, A, and I think the point you made would still have worked completely, but it worked A, B, C, A, B. I mean, is that important or just irrelevant?
Not at this juncture. I
Okay.
don't know that I don't think we'll get quite that far in our reasoning today. All I'm doing is just trying to illustrate how each of these works. Question of how also how are they different? Okay, that's already another point that I don't think we'll have a chance to get to
Okay.
today. Okay.
Can I ask you about Boshes, about the humiliation? It's
Yes,
the only
please.
one where they bring a proof text. Where there could be proof text for all the others, they only bring it for that. And they talk about intention, that if you don't have the intention, it doesn't count as humiliation. If that's a standard, it works against all the things that happened before. Why would you end the logic with a proof text that moves against the other parts of the Mishnah?
Okay, that's a very good question, but unfortunately, not one that we'll have time to address. Okay, I'd very much like to see.
Okay.
Why is this here? Okay, here we go. Okay, so here we have the text we're looking for. Okay, so you have Arba'a Avot Nezikin. Okay, in the first chapter of Baba Kama. Okay, just very briefly note that the 4 Avot Nezikin that are listed here are all from Shmot chapter 21. They appear more or less in this order, one divergence, okay, and with a break in the middle. So in the Torah as well, you have an interesting grouping of these 4. You have 2, then a break with another topic, then you have the other 2, beginning of chapter 22. Okay, and the Mishnah does a little reshuffling, but more or less preserves the order of Shor, Habor, Vamav'eh, Vahahever. Okay, in our text of the Torah, we also don't have the word Mav'eh. Okay, we have the word Ki Yaver Ish Sadeh Ocheret. Okay, the Mishnah calls it Mav'eh to differentiate it from Hever. Okay, Hever is described in the Torah, ki tetzei eish, if a fire goes out. But at the end of that passage, the Torah says, Shalem Yishalem hamav'ir et ha'be'era. So the Torah already connects these 2. Okay, the mav'eh, which means I send an animal or I let an animal loose and it wanders into my neighbor's field and does damage there. That's called mav'eh. Or the Torah actually calls it v'shilachet bi'iro. Okay, ki yaver ishu v'shilachet bi'iro. So the Torah actually uses the word mav'er there, not mav'eh. Okay, there are versions of the Torah that have the word mav'eh, but that's not our subject. Okay, but you notice right away that there's a kind of 2 and 2 structure in the 4 Avot Nezikin. Ashor v'habor, they rhyme. Hamaveh v'aver, 2 very similar terms. Okay, these are terms taken straight from the Torah. Okay, so the Torah already created this grouping of shor and bor on the one hand, mav'eh and hever on the other hand. So that would be another interesting parallel structure that could be analyzed, but that's not our topic. Okay, so we have these 4 kinds of damages, and the Mishnah goes on to say they're not they can't be derived from one another. Each one of them has certain unique features, so you couldn't learn it from the others. And at the end of the Mishnah, tzada shaveh shabahen, what they have in common is that their way or manner is to damage, that you are obligated to guard them, and when they damage, then you have to pay damages. Okay, the next Mishnah picks up on this theme of guarding and says anything for which I am responsible to guard, I am also responsible for paying. Okay, either I'm responsible for the damage or I'm responsible for paying for the damage. If I am responsible for paying part of the damage, then I have to pay as though it were the whole damage. What exactly that's referring to is an interesting discussion, but not for now. And then the Mishnah gives you a list of prerequisites. When am I held responsible for the damages? When it's property, because we're talking about when property damages property. I didn't physically damage anything. Okay, my property damaged somebody else's property. So that's only when you're talking about property that aren't subject to mi'ilah. Okay, and mi'ilah is if I misappropriate hekdesh, something that belongs to the temple, something that's sanctified. So we're talking about non-sanctified property, property belonging to B'nai Brit, the people who belong to the same covenant. Okay, in other words, fellow Jews. Nechasim hamiyuchadim has to be something that belongs to one particular person, and you're responsible for damages occur in any particular kind of a place, except for a place that is designated specifically for the mazik. There's if I have a dog in my backyard and somebody's rabbit comes into my yard and my dog kills the rabbit, I'm not responsible, because what was his rabbit doing in my yard, right? Ureshut hanizak v'mazik, okay? Or if it's property belongs both to the damager and to the damagee. And again, the concluding formula similar to the previous Mishnah. In all of these cases, the damager is responsible. Mishnah Gimel gives us another list of prerequisites, but now not for the damage, but for the payment. What are the prerequisites for the payment? Shum kesef. The court appraises the damage. That's somewhat reminiscent of what we had at the beginning of chapter 8, right? Where the court has to appraise the damage. The shaveh kesef. You don't have to pay with money, you can pay with property that's worth money. Bifnei beitin. The damage, the damage will be determined by the court. Val piedim, and the court will determine it on the basis of witnesses. And the witnesses have to be bnei chorin and bnei brit. They have to be free men, not slaves. Slave can't be a witness. And they have to be bnei brit. They have to be fellow Jews. Vanashim bichlal hanezek. Women are included in the damages. Vanizak v'amazik b'tashlumin. Again, not entirely clear what case is being referred to here, but the point is that in some case or another, the nizak and the mazik share the payment. Okay, in other words, you pay partial damages and not full damages. Okay, and the final Mishnah of this chapter, there are 5 cases of tam and 5 cases of mu'ad. Tam means, we'll see the examples of tam, ha'beima eina mu'edet, in other words, it's tam, okay, for goring or, goring or striking or biting or lying down on top of, meaning purposely lying down on it in order to damage, or kicking. Okay, for all of these things, the animal is not mu'ad. Not mu'ad, okay, the Torah describes if an ox gores, okay, so then you pay half damages and not full damages. Okay, the chatzuat kaspo, you pay half damages, what the Mishnah will call chatzi nezek. Okay, so that includes not only goring, but also the other kinds of purposeful damage that the animal will perpetrate. Those are all called tamim. These are 5 kinds of tam. Then we have 5 kinds of mu'ad. Now in the Torah, we basically only have 1 kind of mu'ad. The Torah says, the way the Torah uses the term mu'ad is v'hu'ad bivala v'lo yishmerenu. This animal has gored already, and the owner was warned, hu'ad, was warned, okay, and he didn't guard the animal. He didn't take heed of the warnings and let the animal continue. So the first time we give him a dispensation. We say, okay, I understand. He didn't expect his ox to gore. He thought his ox was tame, okay, it was docile. He didn't think it was capable of goring another ox. But once it's already done so, and the owner was warned, so then he's mu'ad, and then he pays full damages. And now the Mishnah extends the term mu'ad to include other cases of responsibility for full damages. So, for example, you have shame, if the animal eats somebody else's produce. Regel, okay, if the animal tramples somebody else's produce. Shane and regel together remind us of a case that we had in the first Mishnah. Anybody? Go back to the first Mishnah. What in the first Mishnah corresponds to Shane and regel? Mav'eh. Mav'eh means when my animal gets into somebody else's field. How does it damage in somebody else's field? 2 ways. It eats produce and it tramples produce. Presumably it does both. Okay, once my animal is loose in somebody else's field, it's going to trample and it's going to eat. Right? So Mav'eh in Mishnah 1 corresponds to Shane and Regel in Mishnah 4. Okay? What about goring? What does that correspond to in Mishnah 1? The shore. That's the goring ox. So what's happening in Mishnah 4 is revisiting different kinds of damages that appeared in Mishnah 1, but from a different perspective. Okay, we'll come back to that point in just a minute. Okay, so the Shane is muad, the regel is muad, the shor hamuad, that's the goring ox. That's the same term we had back in Mishnah 1, the shor, but now we add the shor the 4th time around. Then shor hamazik b'shut hanizak, let's say the ox gores, but in the property of the damagee. So then we say, what's he doing in the other guy's property? He had no business there. So here we hold him fully responsible. And finally, interestingly, v'ha'adam, and man is mu'ad. That's really very surprising. Okay, up till now we've been talking about damage committed by my property. What damage is my property? And now we're talking about damage by man. Is damage by man on the same level? Does it belong to the same category as damage committed by my property, by my ox? In this Mishnah, it seems that the answer is yes. Okay, now we already noted that there's some interesting connections between Mishnah Daled and Mishnah Aleph. But there's another very striking connection between the two of them. the first word of both Mishnayot. Look at the first word of Mishnah Aleph and the first word of Mishnah Daled. What's the connection? Saul, if you're speaking, you're muted.
4 and 5.
Yeah, the numbers. Both Mishnayot open with numbers. And as we've seen, there's quite a lot of parallelism between the ground covered in Mishnah Aleph and the ground covered in Mishnah Daled. We'll come back to that in a minute, but first let's note the two Mishnayot in the middle also have something very striking in common. We'll start with a common phrase that they both have. Anybody pick up on the common phrase?
Meitav, the Tashlumin?
No. Okay, for this,
No.
I'm going to go back to the other document that I had. Okay, let's.
I just want to make sure that you're seeing the comment in the chat. Jennifer is saying, can you just define mu'ed again? Is it forewarned?
Okay, mu'ad in the Torah means forewarned. The Mishnah has redefined it to mean anything for which you pay full damages. So a human being is mu'ad. Any damage he commits, he'll pay. An ox that gores in somebody else's property is mu'ad. Why? Because he had no business in the other guy's property. So mu'ad, and a shein is mu'ad. Why? Because you can't stop a shore from trampling you can't say this was unexpected. It was entirely expected. If he gets anywhere in the vicinity of the other guy's produce, he's going to trample it or eat it. So this is fully expected. So mu'ad takes on three new meanings in the Mishnah, other than the meaning that it had in the Torah. Okay? So look at the term b'nei brit that appears both in Mishnah Bet and Mishnah Gimel. Now, Mishnah Bet and Mishnah Gimel have something else in common. Both of them basically give you a laundry list of preconditions, which they don't elaborate on. They present them telegraphically. Okay? They have nechasim she'en bahem me'ilah, nechasim miyuchadim. Okay? Nechasim she'en shel b'nei brit. Okay, just a laundry list. And Mishnah Gimel is also a laundry list. But what's the connection? Mishnah Gimel gives you a laundry list of how the court operates. Mishnah Bet gives you a laundry list of how the damage was committed. The damage to obligate you in Mishnah Bet has to be damage of certain kinds of people, certain kinds of property and certain kinds of people. It has to be property that belongs to you. It has to be, and not to hekdesh, and not hefker. It has to be property that belongs to another Jew. And the damaging property has to belong to a Jew. Right? That's in Mishnah Bet. It has to occur in a certain kind of a reshut. In Mishnah Gimel, the terms nizak and mazika recur, talking about the payment. There's a case in which they share the payment. And here we're talking not about how the damage occurred, but how the payment is, how you go about assessing and carrying out the payment. And here you need a court and you need witnesses. And the witnesses all have to be b'nei brit, the same term that appeared here. So you have linguistic and thematic connections that link the first Mishnah to the last Mishnah, and that link Mishnah Bet to Mishnah Gimel, the two intermediate Mishnah. Here is our chiastic structure. Okay, the numbers, the term Shedarkan Le'lechu Lazik and the Shaber Kederach Hilucha, same words, different meaning. Can't go into that, but you think about it, you'll see they're using the same words, but with a different meaning. Okay? But they're also thematic connections. Okay, and here, I'd like to come back to this, what Mishnah Aleph has that seems not to be in Mishnah Daled, and what Mishnah Daled has that seems not to be in Mishnah Aleph. Mishnah Daled has damages done by a person, by a human being, by Adam. That wasn't in Mishnah Aleph. But Mishnah Aleph has two cases that weren't in Mishnah Daled, namely bor and hever. Okay, the pit and the fire. Or maybe they are in Mishnah Daled. Maybe these 2 points cancel each other out. How so? Who dug the pit? Who lit the fire? Adam. What I want to argue is that, in fact, Mishnah Aleph and Mishnah Daled exactly correspond to one another, but from 2 very different perspectives. Mishnah Aleph is presenting it from the perspective of damage committed by property. And property is extended to include fire and bor. Bor and eish are both forms of property, even though they're not really property. Fire doesn't belong to me, but I'm responsible for it, so it's like my property. The pit in the Reshut HaRabim doesn't belong to me, but I'm responsible for it, so I treat it like property. So Mishnah Aleph is all about it when my property damages, and that includes the cases of bor and eish. And Mishnah Daled is looking at the same list of damages and viewing it from the perspective of some of these damages are unexpected, called tam. They're unusual, they're out of the ordinary, I don't expect them, so they're called tam, and I'm only partially responsible. And some of the damages are mu'ad, and I am fully responsible. And the damages that are mu'ad exactly correspond, I want to argue, to the damages in Mishnah Aleph, but they're presented differently. Now, mav'eh turns into shein and regel. And now, bor and eish turn into adam. Now, that difference in perspective becomes very important later on in Baba Kama. What I'd like to do is just conclude by giving some thought to why the Mishnah created this chiastic structure. Part of the reason is to highlight these connections. But I think that's only part of the answer. I think there's another part of the answer. And one thing a chiastic structure does that a parallel structure does not do, okay, is it sort of pits the middle against the ends, against the extremities. Because if I look at Mishnah Aleph and Mishnah Daled, Mishnah Aleph and Mishnah Daled are all about the question, what kinds of damage am I responsible for? And Mishnah Bet and Mishnah Gimel are not about what kinds of damage am I responsible for, but the connection between the people that creates the responsibility. Mishnah Bet talks about the damager and the damagee. What kind of people are they? How are they connected to the property? How are they connected to one another? Mishnah Gimel talks about the social institution of the court that has to determine the payment. And we find a lot of the same qualities in how the court operates as in how the damages operate. Because Mishnah Bet and Mishnah Gimel are talking about how does the society intervene in order to adjudicate between the mazik and the nizak. Mishnah Aleph and Mishnah Daled present what is the damage? How does the damage occur? From 2 different perspectives. More or less the same damages presented from 2 different perspectives. And in between, Mishnah Bet and Mishnah Gimel present how the society mediates between the damager and the damagee. Okay? And I think by doing that, the Mishnah is indicating that there are two major factors that govern the laws of damages. One factor has to do simply with the nature of what occurred, the nature of the damage, the kind of responsibility that the damager has for what occurred. And then in between those two, we have the two Mishnayot that say, but there's another aspect that also has to be taken into account. The damager and the damagee have to be co-members of the same society. They have to be B'nai Brit. That's the significance of B'nai Brit. That's what links them. And the social institutions that then govern how we address each case of damage reflect the fact that they belong to the same society. Someone from outside that society won't get the same treatment. Because damage has not only to do with the objective fact, what happened and what kind of responsibility do I have for what happened. It also has to do with what kind of relationship do I have with the person whom I damaged. And how does the society adjudicate between us and ultimately try to bring us together. So those are, again, two separate axes for how damages are related to us. So the chiastic structure of the chapter, I think, highlights that point about how the different aspects have to all be taken into account in assessing damages. And thank you all. Erev Tov.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much. I'll put everyone on mute just so you can hear me without distraction, and let me bring up the spotlight. Okay, thank you so much. This was wonderful. Does anyone have any questions actually before I close? Do we have time for questions, Rabbi Walfish?
Yes, we have a couple of minutes for questions.
Okay,
Yeah.
and does anyone have any? Oh, Jennifer, there you go. No? Oh, okay. So Gloria, no, Michael?
Well,
Okay, Gloria, yes.
Okay,
Okay, Gloria and then Michael.
I'm a little confused in the Mishnah in chapter 8, where we said Nezek is about permanent damage. And then we said, but Shevet is about lost wages in that diminished state. But what seems to be missing is, what if I broke my arm? It's going to be fixed. It's a temporary damage, but I'm laid up in bed for a month and I can't do what will eventually be my original job, but there's this longer period that I can't do it.
Yeah, so in that case, there would be Shevet, there would not be Nezek. There would be no Nezek in that case.
But the Shevet would
Nezek
be
is
the
only in the
full-
case where the damage is permanent. Other than that, you would only pay Shevet.
But the Shevet is defined as the cucumber watcher, not the concert pianist.
Right, because we're talking about the case where he was a concert pianist, which he will never be again. So for that, he was compensated. So the Shevet now, we pay him not for what he would have earned as a concert pianist, because I paid him for that permanently, paid him for that for his whole life. So that's why we assess him that way. But if there's no real Nezek, then I will assess his Shevet based on his real profession, because he'll go back to it. So I pay him for his inability to perform that profession for a period of time. Okay? Yes, Michael.
This may a bit be beyond, but the point you just made in terms of chapter 1 and the internal element of the community and the relationships between them, that emerge out of these cases. And yet in the 8th chapter, the case of how do we know to evaluate damage? We look at the slave being sold on the street, which is completely outside of the community. Do you get what I'm saying?
Yes, I know what you're saying, and there there are commentators who are very troubled by that and who say that the Eved we're talking about in the Mishnah is an Eved Ivri. And it's precisely for that reason. It's a very difficult read of the Mishnah because the Mishnah talks about an Eved who sold in the marketplace, which means an Eved Knaani.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
But the point is, in order to assess the value of a person's physical damage, you have no choice but to view him as outside the community. Okay. Now, I think the Mishnah itself addresses that concern later in the chapter, and that's what I hoped we might have time. I didn't think we would, but I hoped against hope we might have time for it. You look later in the chapter, and the idea of Eved comes up again, and Ro'ino to Ki'ilu comes up again in a very different way, and I think the Mishnah is addressing exactly that concern. And I think the Mishnah is really telling a story that you start off looking at him in a certain way, and by the time you're finished, you should be looking at him differently. But again, that's taking us into a whole other discussion that maybe next semester we'll have an opportunity to discuss, but not now.
All right, but thank you. This has been wonderful. I really appreciate the teaching.
Thank you all. Erev Tov.
Okay, thank you, Rabbi Walfish, and thank you everyone who joined us, not only on Zoom, but also on Facebook. Thank you so much, everyone. Lehitraot.